going to begin proceedings at the fashionably late 5 minutes, making allowance for the weather. And I'd like to thank you all very much for coming to our workshop or event today. Just a quick few things. I'll be introducing people as they come to the programme, but our exits are to the left and the right where you may have come in, and toilets are on the corridor down to the left here. At around 11:30, after our questions and answers session, we'll be having, I think, tea and coffee outside on this side. And we're open to conversations. I think we've invited you here to talk perhaps about relatives or acquaintances who may have been part of the staff or indeed patients in Grangegorman. So thank you again for coming. I'd like first of all to ask Philip Cohen, the chair of the Grangegorman Histories working group, to say hello and to introduce the proceedings.
Thank you. Thanks, Colm, for that. And just to introduce Colm Murray, who has helped to organise today. I'm here as chair of Grangegorman Histories, as Colm said, and you'll see in your places two postcards. One is a picture from the 1950s, which shows the extent of the buildings here on the site. As they were 70 years ago, and please feel free to take that away. There's a bigger version just near the door, and this is our bookmark. And the important thing about the bookmark is it has our website on the back, grangegormanhistories.ie, and I'll keep saying grangegormanhistories.ie, and I would encourage you to go to the website and to see the wealth of resources we have there on the web. We have been running Grangegorman Histories is a partnership project, and we were set up 6 years ago to research and to promote the history of the site. Clearly, there's lots of new buildings on the campus. It's mostly Technological University Dublin with HSE facilities and an Educate Together school, but the emphasis is on the history of the site, and it's a commitment of the developers of the site that the student, staff, visitors are made aware of the history of the site, which goes back nearly 250 years. So I would encourage you to look at the website, and I would encourage you to look out for some of the future activities that we as Grangegorman Histories have. Two other things I must say. Thank you all for turning out. The weather's atrocious, so fair play to you for coming. And secondly, I have to mention Brian Donnelly, who's here, who's going to be speaking very shortly. It's true to say that without Brian Donnelly, there would be no Grangegorman Histories. I don't know how much people know about the archives and about Brian, but Brian Donnelly with Father Pierce, who was the chaplain on the site, and with Dick Bennett, who was the chief nursing officer for the hospital. When the hospital was being wound down, Brian and Dick and Father Pierce and other volunteers used to go up into the attics and down in the cellars and would find the archives and find the records relating to the hospital. Those archives and records are now held mostly in the National Archives, and that's what we're going to be talking about mostly today. But it was Brian who helped rescue those records. It was Brian who got them cleaned, preserved and catalogued, and that's why they are there now in the National Archives for you all to access and to enjoy and to research. One other thing about Brian actually retired yesterday from the National Archives. Yesterday was his retirement day. Today is his first day of freedom, and we're particularly pleased that he's come to spend that day with us here to give us the benefit of his extensive knowledge of the archives. So when Brian does speak, I hope that you'll give him due respect for that. I'm now going to hand back to Colm and the meat of today's meeting. Thank you.
So I'm going to pick up on something that Philip said there, public history. And it's what Grangegorman Histories is about. It's about making something that is private and from the past part of our present tense, and something that people can engage with. And as Philip has said, the archive is a crucial part of that, the documentation, the facts, the figures, the names, the dates and so on when things happened, and an incredibly important resource, which I hope we'll be introducing you to here today. But there is another component to public history, and that's why I'm so grateful to see so many people in the room on such a wet day. And that is that it's not just meant to be for historians and for history books. It's also, history involves people, and public history is one which includes the memories and the personal and maybe even private documentation that people have or have in their families or in their archives. I think as part of our invitation to you today, we've asked you to bring things that maybe are mementos or private records or personal records of people whose lives were passed in Grangegorman. I'm not sure if many or any of you did, but we'll certainly be very interested in hearing about that and having a discussion about your family and your connections. I'll tell you a little bit about myself before I ask Brian to speak, and about how this workshop has come about. I'm an architect, and I'm intrigued by Grangegorman, and I'm doing this PhD research on the site from very early times, 1770, until the HSE closed it. And, sorry, I've got my phone turned off. The architecture of the place is something that excites me, and I think there are intriguing lessons about what we will call site and society, what the buildings tell us about the world in which they were formed, and indeed how they may have impacted on the lives of the people who lived in them. But what we've discovered through the process of carrying out workshops is that people are passionately interested not in the bricks and stones, but in their family members and the people whose lives they know who passed through Grangegorman. And that's the reason why we want to pull up that thread and try and make that more accessible to people as a set of stories, a set of things that will become perhaps history. That is why we've put together today's event, to engage with people who have family members or who may have had experiences in Grangegorman over the last 50, 60, 70 years indeed. So our first speaker, I'll get my notes here, I don't really need them in the case of Brian. As Philip has said, senior archivist with the National Archives based in Bishop Street in Dublin. And he's worked over many decades to retrieve, as Philip has said, these records, and he'll be a great loss to anyone who visits the National Archives, because he is truly a fount of information. And I think that the presentation that he's going to give us today, if it's anything like ones he's done in the past, is going to be absolutely intriguing and a fascinating insight into the form of records that were made and what they may be able to tell us about the past, and perhaps even about people that we know from the past. So I'd like you to give a warm introduction to Brian.
Thanks, Colm, and thanks, Philip, for your kind remarks. Yes, I had the privilege of working in the National Archives for several decades, and a lot of my work was involved in taking in records or trying to ensure that records were preserved, and the mental hospital collections, I always thought were really the most interesting and the most significant collections that are out there, you know, and it's wonderful that so much has survived, and so much, particularly in relation to Grangegorman. Grangegorman is really the greatest collection of mental hospital records in the actual in the country. So what I hope to do over the next few minutes is give you an insight into what sort of material actually survives relating to Grangegorman, what's in the National Archives. Some material relating to the hospital is freely accessible, you know, but the records of the hospital itself, they are accessible, but you have to go through certain steps to access them, and I'll explain these later. You know, so that's the National Archives building in Bishop Street, where we have our reading room, and every week there'll be somebody there looking at the Grangegorman records, actually, you know. So in 1772 legislation was introduced for the establishment of houses of industry in every county in Ireland, and one opened in 1773 in where Brunswick Street is now, and the House of Industry was like a bit like a workhouse, a 19th century workhouse in some ways, but they also provided care for the mentally ill. Now, it was a pretty crude form of care. The minute books of the House of Industry are in the National Archives, but unfortunately no registers of patients survive. But there might be the odd mention of patients in the actual minute book. But the people who were running the House of Industry, they were quite concerned about the care of the mentally ill, and they purchased land and buildings, or they purchased land to ensure that a separate institution was built for the specific care of the mentally ill. And this institution, the Richmond Asylum here, opened to patients on the 28th of February 1814. So this is this is the first register of the Richmond Asylum, and you can see that the first man to come in was a man called Andrew Kinley, who had been born in Armagh. And he'd come from Newry. He was a soldier. A lot of information in the actual registers. Initially, most of the patients, or virtually all of the patients initially, they came from the House of Industry. You know, they were sending patients in, and there was an attempt to ensure that the people who were transferred to the new asylum were people who would benefit from care, you know, of course, in time, the asylum, you know, became full of people who had chronic illnesses, you know, who could, and then that led to overcrowding. But interesting, at the beginning, they were trying to ensure that the people that came in were people who would benefit. That's the other page of the register, and it gives various details, the type of disease. Again, in this early period, the categories, you know, pretty simple, you know, mania, melancholia, that sort of thing. There's also various categories regarding the forms of restraint, you know, if people needed to be restrained, and details as to when people were discharged or died. So, the registers of admission, there are very complete runs of them, almost complete, from 1814 right up to the late 20th century, you know, incredible runs. The patient details, they changed over time, but they generally include registration number, name, age, date of admission, religion, place of birth, place of abode before admission, occupation or trade, by whom the admission was recommended, probable cause of illness, failure in business, disappointment in love, tea drinking, was one of the things that I thought people became insane from, but interesting little insight into the cause of the illness, whether the illness was temporary, how long they were ill before admission, species of disease, melancholia, whatever, mania, the area of chargeability, the date of discharge or death, and observations. So at the very basic level, there should be a reference, with a bit of luck, to somebody in the register of admissions. You're getting that basic information, and judging from the registers, now sometimes the numbering sequence in the early period changed later, but I reckon that by 1901 there were over 20,000 admissions, so there were over 20,000 admissions. So a lot of people went through. As I mentioned, the first admissions were to the House of Industry. Now, the hospital, between 1814 and 1830, it catered for the whole of Ireland. So you're getting people coming in from everywhere. But the government, they initiate this huge building program. They built this mental hospital infrastructure after 1814. It was pretty complete by the late 1860s, 1870s. As more local asylums were established, the Richmond Asylum here became the Richmond District Lunatic Asylum in 1830. It catered for the city and county of Dublin, the counties of Wicklow, Meath and Louth, and the county and town of Drogheda. Meath was detached from the district in 1855, and Louth in 1933. They built a separate asylum in Louth. So for much of the organisations, the institution's existence, it caters for the metropolitan area and outlying country areas, places like Wicklow, So you're getting interesting spread of patients, people coming from rural areas and people coming from metropolitan areas, And that's a map, an ordnance survey map of Grangegorman here in 1838. It's a thing called an OS 140, 5 foot to the mile, a huge scale. And you can see down at the bottom is the mental hospital. Up there is the penitentiary, and over on the right hand side here is what became the North Dublin Union Workhouse. So it's an incredible amalgamation of institutions, within an incredibly relatively small area. Now, this is 1838. There was the Poor Law Act was only passed in 1838, but you see those buildings are still there. And the reason those buildings are there in 1838, most workhouses didn't start building them, maybe finishing them in the early 1840s, is because those are House of Industry buildings. The old House of Industry had constructed buildings there, and they were taken over by the Poor Law, and those buildings became the North Dublin Union Workhouse. So they're all in close proximity, and there's a symbiotic relationship between all these institutions. Many admissions to the Richmond Asylum were from the workhouse and the penitentiary. Now, in the National Archives, we've very extensive collections of records relating to the North Dublin Union Workhouse and the Richmond Penitentiary, and these records are open. And, of course, in these workhouses, there would have been what were termed lunatic and idiot wards. And I know from looking at the committal forms, I think when people became unruly, they were often sent to the asylum here. the committal form, you know, there'll be something about maybe the master of the workhouse, he's a manager of the workhouse, he will have the person transferred. He'll say something like, this particular individual, you know, threatened him with a poker or something. This was violent, you know, and the person would be transferred. So this relationship between all these institutions, you know, it's a symbiotic sort of relationship. And this is a workhouse register for the North Dublin Union. So you're getting the names of all the people who are coming into the workhouse right back to the beginning in 1840. I think there's about 144 of these books. Some of them have about 5,000 entries in them. So you're talking about hundreds of thousands of people coming in and out. Of course, sometimes they're the same people. You know, they might come in for a few years and go out, or people are constantly coming in. But there's a great record of all the institutions here and the relationship between them, and that's the right hand side page. The far right column gives the date of death or discharge, and sometimes they'll note where the person is going, you know, to the asylum or something like this. So very useful information. Okay, now we've a big collection in the National Archives of records relating to Dublin Castle, the CSORP, the Chief Secretary's Office registered papers. And there are many references to the asylum here. These records are open, and between 1818 and 1834, they have been very well listed, and they can be searched on a database on our website. From 1834 to 1922, you have to look at these huge big bound volumes in the reading room. The staff will show you how to use them if you need to go in there. So here we have a memorial from, yes, interesting little things. People wanting to get the relatives into the hospital here. This is 1821. This man, Patrick Brady, a memorial. So also another interesting series of records that are available in National Archives are things called convict reference files. And these give details of mentally ill persons who have ended up in jail but are subsequently transferred to asylums, and they're mainly coming here to the Richmond. And they cover the period 1843 to 69. And, they include correspondence from the Office of Lunatic Asylums, and these files are open as well. And this is an example here, a form of committal. This poor man here, Brian Carty from Roundwood, on the 19th of February 1857, he tried to put an end to himself and endeavoured to choke himself. So he tried to commit suicide. So he ended up in Wicklow jail. And this is a letter from the Office of Lunatic Asylums that a warrant may be issued for the transference of the within-named lunatic from the jail of Wicklow to the Richmond District Lunatic Asylum. Even in the 19th century, they realised the jail wasn't a place for the mentally ill. So you have these people coming in, and there are several thousand of these convict reference files relating to mentally ill people, and they're available in the archives. They're open as well. Now, committal forms. When somebody came into the archives, they had to. There was a committal form, it was a legal document that brought them in. About 15,000 of them survive before 1901 for Grangegorman, and a lot of the people in them, if these committal forms didn't exist, would be absolutely undocumented. There'd be no reference to them anywhere. And in the committal forms, the reasons for the patient's admission are more detailed than appears in the registers of admission. And the committal forms often contain correspondence, copies of telegrams, passes, etc., and the names and details of relatives often appear on the actual forms, and this is a very early form, and it relates to a person lived near Ballymahon in County Longford, and she's applying to have a relative admitted, and on the back of it you have the name of the mother of the person they want to admit, and the names of two of her brothers, and their occupations and addresses, and this appears in the committal forms. You could have the names of three relatives. So apart from the pre-1901s, you've 15,000 patients, you also have 45,000 relatives mentioned as well, so really a really great source. So, of course, there's good stuff in the archives about the background. This is in the mid-19th century, when Dr. Lawler was running the mental hospital. Most of the patients, they went to school, and you have details of the sort of subjects they were covering. Of course, often people coming into the archives, they want to know something about the environment in which people lived within the archives. Later on, of course, the institution here was extended. The Mail House was built in the 1850s. We've maps of the Mail House. We photographs. This is probably a photograph taken in the 60s. I think this building is demolished now. This is the photograph of the site in the late 1890s. And in 1897, the prison was taken over by the mental hospital, and you see there down at the bottom it's called the Annex, and it was known as the Annex right up until recently. But you can see the hospital has been extended greatly since 1838. So the asylum took over the Richmond Penitentiary building, and an auxiliary mental hospital was constructed in Portrane from the late 1890s and was completed in 1902 with accommodation for 900 patients. And the Richmond Asylum thereafter generally catered for acute patients and Portrane for chronic patients. And people often ask me, are there patients are there records for Portrane? Well, patients in Portrane, as I understand it, are recorded in the main Grangegorman books. So you went into Grangegorman initially, and maybe a person would be sent to Portrane later on, but there should be a mention of them in the registers or the committal forms. And I just make mention of case notes. When patients were admitted, they were interviewed by medical staff, and notes were taken with regard to their condition and entered in the case books. And these case books survive from around 1880. So, some retrospective entries relating to patients admitted from the 1850s appear in the first books, and from the early 1890s, they often include photographs of the patients. And from 1909, the case books, they were known as death and discharge books, because from that date they were arranged by the date patients died or were discharged. And here are some photographs from the 1890s of patients, really beautiful photographs. Glass plate negatives were used. This is, interesting, people's dress and really marvelous photographs, actually, and this is a very interesting photograph. This lady here, she came into the asylum about 1905, and she was in her 90s. And her hair is cut short because I think she'd been in the Rathdown workhouse before that. And she kept on telling them, her case notes state, I was 10 years old in 1798. She keeps on telling them, it's written down several times, I was 10 years old in 1798. And Connolly Norman, who was the RMS, he had somebody go to the Public Record Office and check her census return, which was in existence still then, was later blown up in 22. And so on her committal form is a copy of the census return for 1851. But the census return states that she was 40 in 1851, so she was born in 1811. But what I think, when she was 10 years old, it would have been 1821. And in 1821, there was a lot of agrarian trouble in Ireland. There was a great collapse of agricultural prices, secret societies. There was attempts to evict people on a mass scale. And there was a lot of trouble and a lot of violence. And this thing, the Insurrection Act was introduced. Curfews were imposed. And, soldiers would be going into people's cabins at night to check that people were still at home. If you were caught out without a pass, you could be transported. And I'm sure that's what she's remembering. And she thinks it was 1798 because, in 1905, she's looking back, 70, 80 decades, and she's remembering all this trouble, and she thought it was 1798, but in fact, it was the Troubles in 1821. I'm sure that's what she was remembering. But really interesting little things, and that poor lady, eventually she was in the asylum for a couple of years. She was very well treated there, but she died of dysentery, unfortunately, in her late 90s, So anyway, I just mentioned the Richmond War Hospital. This was a war hospital established to treat people suffering from shell shock, and registers of admission survived from 1916 to 19. That's when it operated. There's a case book. There are admission forms. Actually, and later on I should mention there are correspondence with the British Ministry of Pensions in relation to the military patients from around 1919. This is a photograph, and you can see some of the soldiers sitting outside. And this is the final report, a very interesting report, and they're lauding the fact that these people had come in, they were treated. They weren't actually certified as insane. They didn't want to taint them with the stain of insanity. But it's very interesting. Fully 1/4 of those admitted were of low mentality, for whom treatment could do very little, And you wonder. And I remember there was somebody in the archives there a couple of years ago. They were doing something on a provincial town during the First World War, and they said it was interesting. Late in the war, when the British were running out of men, all the corner boys in the town, they suddenly disappeared. And these would be fellas, maybe they were a slight intellectual disability, the simple sort of fellas wouldn't be able to hold down a job, they'd be hanging around. But they had been inveigled into joining the army because they were so short of men. And I'm sure those people of low intellect, those are probably those poor unfortunates who would join the army, But there's not more research to be done, on that as well. So just something on staff. Of course, the treatment of staff, or the treatment of patients by staff, it was a big issue back in the 19th century and 20th century. And this is from a handbook in 1914. Cruelty to patients will under no circumstances be tolerated, and it must be remembered that neglect of those who are unable to look after themselves is equivalent to cruelty. So patient care, was a big thing, and of course the attendants, they had to exercise great restraint on occasion. They were liable to be assaulted, by patients, this is a photograph from 1898 of the cricket team, some of the staff in Grangegorman. There are many other photographs. This is one of the Nightingale wards in the hospital. You know, some of the nurses. You can see the beds are very close together. It was, you know, I think it was a pretty good system in terms of a small number of staff being able to monitor large numbers of patients. You know, this looks like a Corpus Christi procession in the 60s. Now, there are a lot of photographs as well in the collection. So, staff appointments, resignations, dismissals are frequently mentioned in the minute books from 1815. There are nurses and attendants pay books for Grangegorman and Portrane from 1915, and staff are sometimes mentioned in the Chief Secretary's Office register papers in the National Archives from 1818 to 1922. Now, of course, various other developments. The name was changed to Grangegorman Mental Hospital. There were various innovations. Well, insulin therapy, ECT, was introduced in the 1920s, 1940s. The nurses' home was built. The name was changed to St Brendan's in 1958. And the hospital closed, of course, in 2013. Preserving the records of St Brendan's archives, existing and retired staff, including the chaplain, Piers O'Doul, and the director of nursing, Nick Bennett, they ensured the preservation of the archives from the 1970s. And thank God, a generous grant from the Wellcome Trust allowed the records to be transferred to the National Archives, where they were conserved and listed. And this is a photograph of, many of you who knew Piers O'Doul and Dick Bennett will recognise them. This appeared in the Sunday Times, call for cash to preserve asylum files, you know. But luckily, the Wellcome Trust stepped in. This is the stuff been loaded, you know, to be brought, to be irradiated before work began in the archives on the material. I think this is the box has been loaded at the irradiation centre. This is the material been processed. These are committal forms, each individual form been cleaned, you know. Here's a man inputting the committal forms onto a database, you know. So if we get a query from the hospital, we look in this committal form database initially to see if there's a committal form. A lot of the material, sadly, had been badly damaged over the course of the years. This is a minute book covered in pigeon droppings, and there was a lot of conservation work done on the records as well. And here we have the same minute book after conservation, you know. So, just a summary. This is the last slide summary. St Brendan's Hospital Archives, registers of admissions from 1814, minute books from 1815, committal forms from the early 19th century, case books from 1880. Richmond War Hospital records from 1916 to 1919, and another 25 categories of records, you know, 25 categories of records. Now, people wishing to obtain information from or access the archives, the person to contact is Danny Connellan over in the HSE. Danny is in charge of the FOI section over there. Now, if you have a relative in the archives, you know, or that was in the mental hospital, and you want to know more about that relative, get on to Danny Connellan, and he'll be ask you for proof, of course, of your relationship to the person. And then what happens is Danny gets on to the National Archives, and he gives the details as you send in, the name, the approximate date the person was in there, and the National Archives staff do a search and send it back to Danny. Now, in terms of people doing academic research, they can apply to Danny as well, and the request will be processed. There are various levels of access for people doing academic or other research. Level 1 is sort of research, access to records irrespective on the date on which they were created. Level 2 is genealogical or other access to records of an individual patient that are less than 120 years old. And level 3 is general access to any and all types of records that are 120 years old or older. And of course, people who are given access to the records, you know, they have to sign, a particular form stating that perhaps details, personal details that might identify the patient won't be noted down, during the course of that research, But a lot of people have had access to the records through that process. I know there was somebody in there yesterday. Every week there are people in there, looking at the stuff. Hopefully, at some stage, there'll be. I'm sure it will happen in due course. There'll be a sort of simpler way of accessing the records. Records beyond a certain age will be freely accessible. That will happen, I'm sure, and But the main thing is, anyway, the records have been preserved. They have been properly listed, and they are accessible through existing procedures. Yeah. So, and I should say, of course, during the course of my work in the National Archives, I was involved in various surveys of hospital records. There's an awful lot of material around the country still. Some of it is still held in the old mental hospital buildings. The National Archives took in a couple of collections. The records of St Bridget's Hospital in Ballinasloe, probably the biggest hospital after Grangegorman. Great collection of stuff, that's in the National Archives now. And also St Columba's Sligo District Mental Hospital, which catered for County Leitrim and Sligo. When that closed years ago, we took in those records. And the records of Our Ladies in Cork, that closed up in the late 80s. Those records are in Cork archives. The records of Our Ladies in Ennis are in the Clare archives, and the records of St Conal's in Donegal are in the Donegal archives. So some collections are in archival custody, but there is still material held locally, and hopefully in time they will make their way into archival custody, and eventually they'll become accessible for research purposes. Yeah. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Brian. Such an interesting introduction to a huge source of information. And maybe if there are questions about any of the threads that Brian has put at our disposal today, we might have a discussion about them in a short while. Next, I'd like to introduce Fiona Fitzsimons, who's a founder of Enniclon Limited, a Trinity College campus company, an enterprise that grew out of a college. She's the director of the Irish Family History Centre at EPIC, and she teaches an evening course over 2 years on Irish family and social history in Trinity College in Dublin here. She's a columnist with the Irish Lives Remembered and with History Ireland. And I think Fiona is going to talk to us about maybe a broader look at the ways of researching family history related to Dublin, maybe in particular. So I'd like you to welcome Fiona.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here with you this morning. I'm actually amazed, considering the night we've had, the rain and the wind, that there's so many of you here. And it's lovely to join such a distinguished panel and to have the chance to speak with you. Now, I've been asked to speak about how to trace an ancestor who may have been institutionalized within the asylum system. And I want to start with a reassurance that tracing an ancestor within the system is actually much easier than you might think. It's not a dark art. There isn't a secret handshake that you have to know to get through to the records. It's about knowing which sources to use and then applying a clear method to investigate, step by step. And if we are systematic and a little bit stubborn, we'll actually get across the line. Why does it matter? Well, it matters because many Irish families have hidden histories of institutionalisation. Shame has often led to silence, and those silences erase people from the family story. What we want to do is to try and bring them back in. We want to restore dignity and give proper context to their lives. And my contribution to the panel is to try and set out the practical steps to find these records, beyond the patient records, which Brian has spoken about, and a way of thinking that maybe helps you to tell the story honestly and well. You might not think of yourself as an expert, but actually you are. You already carry a huge amount of knowledge. First, you've got the stories and the oral traditions that have been passed down within your family. You probably learned them almost by a process of osmosis, by being told them as a child continuously by your parents, if you were lucky enough, your grandparents, aunts and uncles, maybe visiting the places where your family were from. Some of these stories might be accurate, some of them might be embroidered, but you'll actually usually find there's a grain of truth there. And that can be one of the more interesting parts of my job, is trying to work out how accurate is a story that's passed down over generations. How long can it actually maintain accuracy? And wheedling out, tracing what the actual truth is. Thing is, whether embroidered or not, these are all clues that we can use. Second, you probably have family papers tucked away somewhere in an attic or wherever. And all these scraps of paper count as evidence. And third, you carry your family DNA in every cell of your body. And that is evidence too, whether or not you've actually gone ahead and got one of the commercial tests and begun to try and use it to incorporate it as a research method within your research. Now, the genealogist's task is to take these three strands, memory, paper, and DNA, and first of all to reconcile them with each other, and then to match them up with public records, because that's when you begin to build a solid, rounded picture of your family's past. Now, most searches begin with a story. You might hear it at a family visit or at a funeral, anywhere that brings extended family together. And if your family is like mine, a family funeral can have first and second and third and even fourth cousins. But what if there's no funerals on the horizon? Well, then it's time to look closely at maybe at the work that you have already done and to start asking yourself, where are the gaps? Who are the people who leave the party early, disappearing from the historical record? And this isn't always a straightforward exercise, because emigration was baked into the Irish experience. And many people simply went overseas, and over time, they gradually lost touch, lost contact with the people at home. We also have the situation that in the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, an awful lot of young people entered religious orders. And of course, once they were professed, they took on new names, new identities, and they left their birth identities behind them. So what should you be looking for? Well, it can be as nebulous as trying to look at the records and to discern whether somebody has simply disappeared from the historical records. Now, there's a saying among genealogists that even a negative result tells us something positive. But to try and put this on a more practical, concrete level, I usually start by trying to trace or descend every sibling in every generation that I'm looking at. So looking at my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, and the generations above that. Many Irish families had family members with additional needs or learning difficulties. And they were usually cared for at home as long as their parents were alive. But what happened when the carer got too old to be able to manage anymore? It's usually at that time that we actually find a person institutionalized. And don't forget the emigrants, ancestors who went abroad, who went overseas, and they lost touch with their family at home. I've actually found an awful lot of emigrants. There's a very high rate of committal in the host country when people settle. And some of this is when people maybe become too old and infirm for their families to look after. But I also know, looking at the Earl Grey girls in Australia, looking at families in America, particularly famine immigrants, so people who would have left between 1845 and the early 1860s, they're leaving an awful lot of trauma. And there's a much higher rate of institutionalization among that particular group of Irish immigrants going overseas than in any other immigrant group settling in North America at that time. Now, each of these absences, each of these silences from the records is worth paying attention to. And sometimes the best clues are stories that are incomplete or missing key facts. Now, I've worked with people over the years who were trying to trace family members who subsequently turned out to be in asylums. Sometimes they had an idea that that's what they were working towards. Sometimes they simply knew that the person disappeared off the page of history. And I was working with them to try and see if we could locate where they had turned up. And these are some of the stories that I have heard, the stories that were told within people's families to try and explain why they were absent. One man was told that his grandmother had simply abandoned the family. Another woman was told that her grandmother had died in childbirth. But when the civil records were published on Irish genealogy, she went looking for her uncle, the child's birth, and she found that, sure enough, but not her grandmother's death record. We eventually found that 35 years later. One man was told that his aunt was with the nuns in Ballinasloe, and that's the kind of phrase that deserves a much closer look. It's a very Irish kind of fudge. You're telling the truth, but it's not the full story. There was a great uncle who was supposed to have left the farm to travel for work, but then the trail goes cold. And a great aunt who was said to have gone off to care for a relative, but who never reappeared in the family story. Now, these silences, these gaps, are often where you find the first thread. And once you begin to pull on that thread, it can help to unwind, to unravel the whole narrative. Okay, so once you have a family story, the next step is to try and pin it down, to anchor it with a document. And the best way to do that is to look at what I call the catch-all sources. These are the big record sets that include everybody, eventually. Now, in most countries, those catch-all sources would include the census records. But in Ireland, we've lost almost our entire 19th century census records. I think we have something like 1.5% that survives. And the earliest complete census dates from 1901 and 1911. And of course, we will have the 1926 census, I think in April next year. But here, the civil death records will often do the heavy lifting for us. The civil death of a person who died within an asylum will record the person's full legal name, including married names of women, the family residence at the person's time of admission, and that's crucial, the date and place of death, the person's age at their last birthday. And if you look at the informant is the occupier of the house. That's laid down by statute. But in a medical setting, the occupier in a hospital or asylum, that will always be the medical officer. So once you've identified your asylum ancestor in a death record, the next step is to start developing your research outward. What kind of records do you look for? Well, where they survive, we look for private papers, things like letters or diaries. This can add a lot of good personal context that the official records simply won't have captured. If the person's incarceration came after a legal process, you may find evidence in the newspapers. And in the early and mid-19th century, the unfortunately named commissions of lunacy would often be published, full stories published in the local newspaper. And you sometimes see references to commissions of lunacy, though these are usually for people who had a lot of property, or people who maybe who were committed after violent acts, something which was maybe very public. Newspapers will also tell you when somebody absconded from an asylum, and sometimes, particularly in the 1850s, 60s, in the second half of the 19th century, there seems to be almost a seasonal cycle of institutionalization. So people are brought out of the asylum during the agricultural season when a heavy arm, a strong arm is actually required on the farm, and then they are put back in. So after the harvest, you'll find people being readmitted. And sometimes you actually find accounts of people maybe breaking the law or going on a jaunt while they are released from the asylum in the newspapers. We also find where people die suddenly, sometimes unfortunately by their own hand or by accident. We'll find inquests reported in a newspaper. Now, even where the original inquest or coroner's records don't survive, and they don't survive until the late 19th century for an awful lot of counties, you will find a record of these in the newspaper, in the local paper. Workhouse records can be very revealing because, particularly in the mid-19th century, many inmates, including children and teenagers, young people, would have been transferred from workhouses into asylums or sometimes into reformatory or industrial schools as those systems are rolled out in the 60s and 70s. After 1864, civil registration covered everybody. The dispensary doctor was the person in the locality responsible for recording the deaths, all local deaths, and compliance in Ireland seems to have been very, very thorough. So it's a very good source. Burial records are also, they have good evidence. The oldest, most enduring tradition around death and burial is for a person to be buried in their home place with their own kind. And it's not unusual to see people who had maybe been institutionalized even for 50 or more years, being after their death, being brought home and buried in the family grave. If your ancestor went overseas, you can follow them using the host country records. Look for things like immigration files, census returns, church records, and of course the institutional records. It would have been very common for elderly immigrants, when they became infirm and their families couldn't care for them any longer, to be placed in asylums. But I also contend that there's a much higher rate of institutionalization. And we find that particularly where people are, I suppose, leaving traumatic situations, the rate of institutionalization, particularly among the Earl Grey girls, the young women who were shipped out from workhouses between 1848 and 1850, is very, very high in Australia. And likewise, famine immigrants who settled in North America. What about the current state of access to the patient records themselves? Because in a sense, this is where you're going to find the payload. Well, the very first step is to try and find out what records survive and where they are held. And the previous speaker, Brian Donnelly's survey of hospital archives in Ireland, that's an excellent starting point. It's published on the National Archives website if you weren't lucky enough to get one of the 500 published books. sponsored by the Wellcome Fund. Once you know where the records are, the next step is to write to the relevant authority, whether or not they're still held locally in the hospital or they've been accessioned in a county archive or in the National Archives. Now, at present, access is very restricted. In general, records are only open to the next of kin. In some situations, more distant relatives, like great nieces or nephews, can get limited access if they have a valid reason. And one reason that is always valid is a family health history. Does everyone know what that is? Okay, certain conditions are hereditary, and it's always a good idea to look and see if any of these conditions are in your family. You don't need a professional genealogist to do this, you can do it yourself. To prepare a personal health history, you start by examining the deaths across 3 generations of your family, beginning with your own generation. So your own generation, your parents and your grandparents, and look at the siblings in each one of those generations. Note the cause of death, the duration of the illness, and whether that person was attended by a doctor. Talking about this with Dan Bradley, who's Professor of Genetics in Trinity, he actually pointed out to me that a genetic test is only ever going to tell you whether or not you carry a faulty gene, but that it's only by a family health history that you will know whether or not that gene is switched on, and you have to then try and mitigate that. Now, once you have your family health history, you can give a copy of this to your GP, ask them to make it part of your permanent medical file. And this is something since 2005 that the US Surgeon General recommended that American citizens do. And it really is about time that we began to adopt a similar measure here in Ireland. And like I say, I'm not trying to drum up business. This is something that is probably best done by you yourself. And just 3 generations is all it takes. If you apply to access records, you will be asked to provide identification. And here, women face an additional burden for the simple reason that on marriage, women's family names change. And you may be expected to prove each change of name step by step. The best way to handle this, if you are writing to somebody who actually who controls access to these records, is to provide a simple family tree showing each generation clearly, supported with birth, marriage and death records. Death records for the simple reason that GDPR does not apply to people who are dead. And that makes it much harder for the archive or the authority to refuse your request. Now, of course, once we start talking about access, we have to address the bigger question that even where the records survive and we can secure permission, do we have the right to read them? And that's the ethical dilemma I want to turn to next. This brings us to an ethical question as much as a genealogical one. The argument against access is clear. More than 10 years ago, when I was first writing about these records, I consulted with Brian in the National Archives, and he set out very clearly to me that these records document people in crisis at the moment of their deepest distress, when they were at their most vulnerable. And to read them can sometimes feel like a violation of privacy or even of their dignity. Then there's also the language that's often used in these medical files. The notes can be very uncomfortable. They're filled with attitudes, filled with words, they reflect attitudes that belong to a different era. But I would contend that these negative opinions reflect the prejudices of the medics, not the character of our ancestors. And on the other hand, there's a very strong argument for inclusion. I don't believe that a family is complete without all of its members, even those who were silenced or erased. Their experiences are part of the collective identity that we inherit. When we recover their stories, we are bringing them back into the circle of belonging. We're restoring them to their rightful place in the family. And of course, this isn't just about individual families. In Ireland, institutionalisation was so widespread, it became part of our national story. And that's the bigger context that I want you to think about. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, first half of the 20th century, I should say, Ireland stands out internationally because of its extraordinarily high rates of psychiatric institutionalisation. The rapid growth of the asylum system was driven by several factors. There was much greater recognition of mental illness, yes, and there was a philanthropic impulse to try and provide help. The state also played a central role. It began to build asylums in the early 19th century under the grand jury system. It began to legislate and to regulate mental health. Some writers would say almost obsessively. And underpinning the high rate of admission was poverty. The asylum system grew far beyond psychiatric illness. It absorbed people with intellectual disabilities, people with learning difficulties, and those who were simply vulnerable or unable to be supported at home. So this isn't just a private story for families. This is a public story about Irish society, about policy, and about our culture. If the records remain closed, then past injustices will remain unhidden, unacknowledged, and unchallenged. And a possible compromise might be to allow access 50 years after the death of the person, the inmate, balancing that right to privacy and the right to historical truth. So to draw it all together, tracing an ancestor within the asylum system is not as daunting as it might first seem. With the right sources, a systematic method, and persistence, you will be able to piece their story together. Why does it matter? It matters because many Irish families carry silences within their own histories. Shame and stigma erased people from the historic record. And by searching for them, we restore their dignity, we bring them back into the family narrative. This isn't just about individual families. Ireland's extraordinarily high rate of institutionalisation means this is also a national story, one that shaped our society and culture. And if the records remain closed, then potential past injustices will remain in the dark. I believe that as family historians, we have an important role to play. We are the custodians of memory. Each time we recover a hidden life, we bring that person back into the circle of belonging. And that, in the end, is what family history is really about. Truth, dignity, and connection. So thank you very much for listening. It has been a pleasure, and I'm going to hand back to Colm.
Amazing. Not just a set of techniques, but a whole series of reasons for thinking about our people, the places, the families we come from. I wonder if there are any questions, or would anyone like to make a contribution?
Just with regard to paying patients, of course, the big problem with these asylums, they were supported by the rates, and people weren't inclined to pay any more than the authorities could get out of them, So of course, if the institution thought that the relatives of a patient were in a position to pay for their maintenance, they would try and get the maintenance from them, I think it might have started off in the 1890s, the whole system, paying patients, so these would have been patients, yes, whose I suppose whose relatives or maybe the ward of courts or whatever the Solicitor Ward of Courts might be paying as well. if they had assets, but they were actually paying for the maintenance. Most of the people in the hospital wouldn't have been in a position to pay anything, Now, in the records of Grangegorman, there's a series of books relating to investigations into the capacity of people to pay for their relatives, and maybe in the early days relieving officers, they were later home assistance officers, or maybe the police would make discreet inquiries as to how much money you were getting, whether if you had a son working in Glasgow, were you getting money from them, all this sort of thing. Really interesting information, in the actual books. And I often thought some of the amounts of money that relatives were paying to maintain people in the asylum, they were quite considerable as well, But obviously, any money that was coming in from other sources that would relieve the rates was positive as far as the authorities were concerned. Whether people were treated any better, I'm not quite sure. But I suspect maybe when the old age pension came in, patients would some of it would go to their maintenance, but they'd get something to buy cigarettes or sweets or something, But maybe paying patients got something like that,
Just a little aside on that. One of the historians of Grangegorman, whose name is Thomas King Moylan, is in the minute books of the hospital as being in charge of ferreting out the paying patients and taking care of their records. So it was a tremendously important duty to bring in this meagre source of income into the larger picture of fraught accounts and constant pressures for economy.
Yes, the register of admissions, they start over in 1814. I'm trying to think. I think they certainly go up to the 70s, the register of admissions. But to see those, you'd still have to go through Danny Connellan, in the HSE. They wouldn't be on open access in the archives, But just to say, I mentioned the sort of case notes. We have them. They survived from the 1880s, and they're from 1909. They're called death and discharge books, and they run up to the 50s. Maybe about 1957. And later on, at that point in time, of course, the case files or the case notes on patients, they started keeping them in files, and they were stored in Grangegorman, and I know some of them were destroyed. There was a fire and a flood in the hospital, so. Even the later case files, they may not be completely intact, But anyway, hopefully, you'll get some resolution, in terms of your query,
Do you have any further leads on the registers, Fiona?
On the registers. Well, the thing is that medical records have medical records are under different restrictions. You're always going to be, you have to actually, as Brian says, you have to actually apply through the HSE to access medical records. I suppose where you could use as a blunt instrument the fact that GDPR doesn't apply to people who are dead. And you can always apply to say, if you provide a person's civil death record, you can always apply to access records. But if they're medical records, I think that's actually covered by legislation. Is that correct? Brian is the expert here on archival access.
Unfortunately, as far as archives are concerned, the medical records, they suffer. One of the great things they suffer from is statutory protection. They don't have actually any statutory protection. They're not under the National Archives Act. In fact, because the National Archives Act protects departmental records. Departments can't chuck stuff out. But actually, there's no legislation, similar legislation with regard to the records of HSE. But hopefully that will be coming soon. Legislation is long overdue, and once that legislation is in place, the whole access situation, will be clarified. Hopefully. So.
Actually, can I jump in and just say that there's a real problem, and that is that archives in this country are hugely underfunded. And because they're underfunded, because there isn't enough storage space, there aren't enough archivists in the National Archives, it's very, very difficult for the National Archives to do its job and to take in records, to conserve them and clean them so they can actually be made accessible. We often don't realise that where buildings have been left abandoned, and I've seen photographs of Brian here looking like Indiana Jones, standing in overalls in the middle of files up to his oxters, along with a team of people. Records which have been left in abandoned buildings, left open to the elements. I've been involved in a number of archival projects where Brian spoke about irradiating the records, because records actually have biohazards. So before we can even access them, there's a whole range of treatments that they have to go through before they can actually be put into an archive and made accessible to the general public. So the real hindrance in actually accessing patient records isn't even archivists or people in the HSE acting as gatekeepers. It's actually lack of funding from the state. And I'd love to see something done about that. With regard to accessing records, if you make that family health history argument, you can actually access records. I made a similar argument in writing myself. I wanted to look at records of a great aunt who was held in St. Bridget's in Ballinasloe. Now, I think I did this in 1909 when I first got engaged. And the records were held in the hospital, so I had to write to the clinical director in St. Bridget's. And the argument that I made at the time was I had just got engaged, I began thinking about a family, and I realised that my great aunt had schizophrenia. It's something which is in my husband's family as well. So I wanted to get a clear sense of what this was. You're thinking about a family, you're planning ahead. So I made a medical argument. When I speak about having to provide a family tree, I'm speaking from experience. I provided a 3-generation family tree showing how Fiona Fitzsimons, was related to Bridget O'Connor, who died in Ballinasloe in 1981. And I had to provide all the documentation, my civil birth, which showed that my mother was an O'Connor, my grandparents' marriage record, and then a birth of Bridget and of her brother, my grandfather. So it was quite an exercise assembling a tree and assembling the supporting documentation. But once I had that, I have to say they were very, very helpful. I didn't get access to the records, but I did get to put specific questions that I had with regard to my great aunt, and they answered all of my questions very thoroughly, very completely. And about 2 years later, my uncle, who would have been a generation up from me, so I think the immediate next of kin, was able to access the records, to view the records. It helped that he was a medical doctor. I always think there's a Freemasonry of professions. But he was able to access the records, and he was able to look at them from a medical perspective and able to advise the family. So these records are accessible with a little bit of work.
what we've just heard are two different ways of approaching accessing the records. The documentation in the archives, the formal process of asking for permission through the HSE, but also perhaps a fast track and more personal way of doing so, where you claim that the medical records are medically relevant to you and perhaps to your future descendants, and you may be able to get a different type of access to the records on that basis. So I think there are two different tracks that we've just outlined there.
That was with regard this level 1, level 2, level 3 access. Well, actually, I mean, a lot of records would be more generally available, after 100 years. For example, prison records that we have. We have, convict files. Would be available up until about 100 years ago, but hopefully, in the future, the whole question of access will be formalised. Maybe it will be 100 years that the closure will be. Any records that are over 100 years old will maybe generally available. That will come, I'm sure. But at the moment, though, that isn't in place, unfortunately. But it will come, I'm sure. Well, now again, my sort of general understanding is that maybe patients who are suffering from more chronic conditions were admitted to Portrane, and the more acute people were in Grangegorman. But as I said, as far as I understand it, everybody who comes in initially goes through the books in Grangegorman, and I think if people were readmitted to Grangegorman from Portrane, there should be a paper trail there, in the registers of admissions. I would say, yeah. Hopefully, in the future, there'll be further analysis of the records. I mean, I over the years in various places, I'd be looking at these committal forms. And I look at them and say, some, of course, some people commit acts of extreme violence. Now you can understand, might be a good idea for their own sake and for other people's that they'd be, in a mental institution. Then you'd see something about. Remember that got into one of the mental health I was in. Some poor young fellow had been put in for wandering abroad at night, and you wonder, he was a fellow in his late teens, maybe didn't get on with his father or something, and he didn't want to stay in the house. You would wonder about cases, but judging from the committal form, so a lot of people were in need of care. But of course, all these places, they built all these huge places through some strange law. Of course, they're filled up, and then Professor Brendan Kelly, made a great point. He was saying, in Ballinasloe in the 50s, if somebody had stood up and said, this place should be closed down, most of these people shouldn't be there, they'd have been lynched because, of the population of Ballinasloe, most of them are either patients in the place or staff. And I remember when Our Lady's Hospital in Cork closed down, I went down to list the records. In the late 80s, and the people, there'd been a couple of thousand people there not too long before, and they were saying how during the day, people they'd have their breakfast, they'd go down, the patients, a lot of them and get a pass. They'd go down to Cork, they'd have a wander around, they'd come back for their dinner, and in the afternoon they might go back again. God, should these people have been in the mental hospital, But then again, where would they have been otherwise? The sort of catch-all places, Or I remember being in a county home, looking at records, county home records, this was donkeys years ago, and this lady was telling me, in the old days, tramps, they'd wander from one county home to the other. He said, some of them were very respectable people, guards who lost their jobs through drink, they ended up as tramps, and they'd stay in the county home. The nuns would put them out. But of course, the old days, society had peculiar ways of dealing with, people who didn't fit in, really, that's, yeah. But,
in a way to summarize, sometimes the record in the archive is a concealment of a social issue rather than a revelation. And I think the records of such interesting or maybe appalling social practices won't be in the archive, but they have been written about, and we are trying to come to terms with them. And thinking of a book called Coercive Confinement in Ireland by O'Sullivan and O'Donnell, for example.
I'm sure there would be details in the minute books about when she was appointed. Definitely. And in terms of case notes, obviously people like your relative would have been filling them in. Sometimes they're beautifully written, the notes, but there's no indication as to who actually wrote them, unfortunately, but definitely there'll be a reference in the minute books, I'm sure as well.
Is that okay? I think you've stated the problem very well and very clearly, and I think maybe one of the things that can be taken from today, and we are recording these presentations today, and the fact that so many people are here and are interested, and maybe that becomes a nugget of pressure that we can bring to bear. I think that the initiative to set up procedures and guidelines for accessing records is more than 10 years old, and maybe it needs to come to crystallization. And I think we can say that with full respect for the pressures that the relevant organisation, the HSE, are under. I mean, there will be people waiting in corridors this winter. There'll be staff recruitment problems, as well as hospitals to be built. And this particular issue about family history or our connections with people in institutions, we have to put it in that perspective as well, and perhaps to accept that. But I think we can continue the public history dimension of having an interest and expressing an interest in people through workshops like this, and perhaps finding ways to share information and to open those doors and open those filing cabinets.
Can I make a point of comparison?
Yes.
During the Commission of Inquiry into Child Abuse, the HSE and the state anticipated that on publication of the report there was going to be a huge interest among people who had been in reformatories and orphanages and industrial schools in accessing their own files. And they carried out an archival project specifically to compile a central finding aid and to bring all the records that were known together. So that was very forward thinking, because they were anticipating there was going to be this huge public interest. And it meant that when the report was finally published, the records were accessible. And possibly what you need if you want to actually get something like that, you need to maybe persuade the state and the HSE that this is another instance where public interest is such that they need to put in place a similar kind of archival project to bring together all the records. But if you look at Brian's 2015 book, the survey of medical records, you'll begin to get a sense of the sheer scale of records that were made and that survive. Not all of them have been brought into the National Cultural Institutions or county archives. So, I mean, you're talking about a huge archival investment that is required by the state to, in the first place, safeguard these records, conserve and clean, and then to have them somewhere where they can be accessible.
Because we've stumbled in our researches, not just me, but other people involved in Grangegorman Histories, in a really quite interesting initiative from about 1965 to 1973, where there was a magazine in Grangegorman at first called St. Brendan's Magazine and then called Gateway Magazine. And I think it was put in place by Ivor Brown when he became the chief psychiatrist. And he wanted to open things up in terms of discussion. He put reviews of relevant books. There was reports of GAA games. And there were constant calls for the patients to contribute to the magazine. And one of the ways that patients found a way of expressing themselves was by writing poetry for the magazine. And there are quite a few instances of poems that are revelatory of the preoccupations and the state of mind or the outlook of patients in St. Brendan's. Now, there aren't a huge number of them, but some of them are very powerful and they speak maybe volumes. They resonate with the experience of others. And I think that it's part of Grangegorman Histories' upcoming display, which is going to be in the lobby of the new to-be-opened academic hub at the other side of the road here, that such poetry will feature. At least a few of those poems will feature, because what you've said is incredibly important. And yes, the archive record is written by doctors or nurses or administrators, and they may have an attitude or an opinion or a language to describe what they think is in front of them in terms of a patient, and it's not the same as the perspective of the patient. But I think that, funnily enough, poetry, a few small poems and a few short poems are one really important way that we can gain access into the experience of the patient in these hospitals. And we're going to do something about that, or to make it heard at least.
Just one comment, and that is that the idea of childhood is kind of a modern concept. It's a 20th century, maybe from the 1860s, thinking of Alice in Wonderland, one of the first great works of children's literature. But in the 20th century, right into the 1920s and 30s, most children finish their schooling at 13. They enter the adult world of work. They may have been underemployed, but they were working, they were bringing money home. They wouldn't have seen themselves as being mere children. And there is a bit of a fudge, and this is something, if you look at institutional records in Ireland, you'll often see just all kinds of fudges, and this is one of them, that say where a child is no longer in full-time education, if they're employed, they wouldn't have perceived themselves as a child, and they weren't necessarily treated as a child. But if I go back 100 years, you'll see people who are, they're bringing home the bacon in their family. You see children who are working, who are sometimes tried in the adult courts, who are sent on, and you'll actually find discussions about where do you send the child. Do you send them to an industrial school or a reformatory school, or do you send them to a prison? I mean, one of the great movements, I think Dr. Aoife O'Connor has written very well about this. One of the great pushes from about 1820 to 1920 is to try and create a separate criminal system for people who are minors, so that they're not being tried in the adult courts. And there's all kinds of fudges that you find in every institution as people are trying to work out the process. Just
to mention that Leanne O'Hara's project to write that book, The Patients All Seemed Happy, was funded by Grangegorman Histories in the last 2 years as a project, as one of the projects it funded following an open call. And Leanne, I think, did her research in the National Archives and went through the hoops to get level 1 access, or whatever it's called, and because her output was going to be anonymised, she was given the type of access that she needed. So a way of raising the patient's voice again. Okay, we could continue conversations over coffee. To my left, your right here. And thank you all for your participation. That's been a fantastic morning. And I'd like once again, before we go, to thank our students.